What if I told you that one of the most powerful fleets in history destroyed itself? Not in battle, not by a torpedo, not by a storm, from within, with its own hands. Meeting after meeting, year after year. And here is the proof. The French ironclad battleship Hoche, a flagship, a beauty, a monster. Sailors called it Notre Dame, and that was not a compliment. It was a diagnosis. Today, I am going to tell you a story they don't teach in textbooks. A story about how brilliant people, working together, managed to create an absolute failure. How every correct decision added up to a catastrophe. And how one ugly ship became a mirror reflecting the entire rotten system behind it. You will learn about a classified report that was hidden for 20 years. About an admiral who hated the very ships he commanded. About an engineer who knew the truth, and whom nobody listened to. And in the end, I promise you, you will look at this ridiculous, bulky ship, swaying like a drunken cathedral, through completely different eyes. Watch until the end, because the finale of this story is the most unexpected part. But right now, just look at it. Two massive turrets at the extremities. An armor belt running along the entire hull. Superstructure upon superstructure. Fighting tops on the masts, so high that in a storm they would swing out to the side by several meters. Funnels, little turrets, more superstructures, then another funnel. This isn't a collage. It's not the work of an artist testing out, what if we add a little more? This is a real warship, the flagship of the French fleet, the pride of the Third Republic. Her name was Hoche. French sailors, people with a sense of humor and a rich vocabulary, called her something else. Notre Dame de la Trinité, the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. Because if you looked at her in profile, the silhouette resembled a Gothic cathedral whose spires had been stolen and replaced with gun turrets. The year was 1890, the era of the ironclad battleships. A time when a nation's naval might was measured in tons of steel and inches of armor. A time when Britain, Germany, Italy, and Russia were building ships that made you think, this is what power looks like. And then you look at Hoche, and you realize something entirely different. Here is the paradox of this ship. She was not the result of one person's incompetence. She wasn't dreamed up by some mad engineer at 3 in the morning. Every detail of her monstrous silhouette, every extra superstructure, every awkward fighting top, every gun placed where it shouldn't be, was someone's decision. Weighed, justified, approved by a committee. This is exactly what makes the story of Hoche genuinely fascinating. Because the question isn't why the ship turned out so ugly. The question is, what kind of system is capable, time after time, year after year, meeting after meeting, of producing exactly this result? And why couldn't the people inside this system, smart, experienced, dedicated people, stop it? The answer to that question doesn't begin in 1881, when the keel of the Hoche was laid. It begins earlier, at a time when the French Navy was the best in the world, when France dictated to everyone else what a warship should look like. Because to understand how a great fleet creates something like this, you first have to understand what it was like before it started destroying itself. Toulon, the naval shipyard. A ship is launched into the water. Outwardly, it looks like a regular sailing frigate, an elongated hull, masts, neat proportions. But there is one detail. Along the entire length of the hull, from bow to stern, are iron plates. Each is 4 inches thick. Each weighs several tons. The ship is called La Gloire, and the moment it touched the water, the world of naval warfare was divided into before and after. It was the first seagoing ironclad in history, the first ship to which the wooden hulls of the enemy were no more threatening than paper. The French built it first. Not the British, not the Americans, the French. In London, this news caused something akin to panic. The entire British fleet, hundreds of ships, decades of tradition, millions of pounds, had overnight turned into a collection of beautiful wooden targets. The Admiralty worked around the clock. Just a year later, the British launched HMS Warrior, their answer to La Gloire. Faster, bigger, heavier. They would later claim that Warrior was the first real ironclad. The French would never agree with this. But it's not about arguing over who was first. The point is that in the 1860s, France set the tone. French designers experimented with armor, with engines, with the placement of artillery. French shipyards worked at full capacity. The French fleet was the second in the world, and breathing down the neck of the first. And then came 1870. Prussia declared war. The French army, considered the best in Europe, was crushed in a matter of months. Napoleon III surrendered at Sedan, personally, sword in hand. The Prussians reached Paris. Versailles, where French kings had received ambassadors from all over the world, became the place where Bismarck proclaimed the creation of the German Empire. Deliberately, intentionally, to maximize the humiliation. France lost Alsace and Lorraine. It paid an indemnity of 5 billion francs. And it lost the most important thing, its self-confidence. For the Navy, this had very concrete consequences. The new enemy was on land. The new border was to the east. That meant army, army, and army again. The naval budget was slashed methodically and without regret. Shipyards slowed down. Building programs were scrapped. Shipbuilders, who had worked tirelessly in the 60s, now sat without orders. There is a rule in naval shipbuilding known to anyone who has ever worked in it. If a shipyard doesn't build ships for 2 or 3 years, it doesn't just stand idle. It forgets. People leave. Skills are lost. Supply chains fall apart. And when the money finally returns, it turns out there is practically no one left to build. This is exactly what happened to France in the 1870s. When budgets began to slowly recover by the middle of the decade, the Navy found itself in a situation that could be described in one word: ruins. The ships of the 60s were obsolete. There were almost no new ones. The shipbuilding school that the country had been so proud of had crumbled. And right here, instead of uniting and rebuilding, something started inside the French Navy that admirals preferred not to speak of aloud at official meetings. But it determined everything that would follow. There was a war going on inside the Navy, not with the Germans, not with the British. French admirals were fighting each other over the future of the fleet, over what it should be, over money, over influence, over the right to decide. And this war had 2 sides, 2 camps. 2 completely different ideas about what a modern navy actually was. This war had a name, and it would change everything. Théophile Aube was an admiral who hated battleships. It sounds strange. An admiral who hates the premier warship of his era is roughly like a general who hates tanks. But Aube was a man of logic. And his logic was, in its own way, flawless. Look, a battleship costs an enormous amount of money. One ship is the budget of an entire province. It takes years to build. It needs to be maintained. It requires a crew of thousands. And what does it achieve in the end? It goes out to sea and meets an identical enemy battleship. Then it all comes down to who has the thicker armor and bigger guns. It's an arms race that France, after 1870, is guaranteed to lose. Less money, fewer shipyards, no time. But there is another way. Aube looked at new technologies, torpedoes, torpedo boats, fast cruisers, and saw a revolution. A small torpedo boat costs 100 times less than a battleship. It is built in months, not years. The crew is a few dozen men. But a single torpedo, fired into the side of a hull, can send any battleship to the bottom. Any of them, regardless of the thickness of its armor. Why build one battleship when you can build 100 torpedo boats for the same money? This idea was called the Jeune École, the young school, and it captured the minds of a faction of French naval officers with a kind of force that only truly beautiful ideas possess. Ideas where the weak find a way to defeat the strong, where the poor outmaneuver the rich, where technology renders tradition obsolete. In 1886, Aube became the Minister of the Navy, and he began putting his theory into practice. Battleship programs were slowed down. Funding for large capital ships was cut. Instead, torpedo boats were ordered by the dozens. Shipyards built light cruisers, fast, cheap, armed with torpedoes. The fleet was transforming before their eyes. But on the other side of this war stood men who were called the traditionalists, admirals of the old school, who watched all this with mounting horror. Their arguments were no less logical. A torpedo boat works perfectly in theory, but in reality, it only works in good weather. A little chop on the waves, and the tiny ship can't even put to sea. The torpedoes of that era had a range of a few hundred meters. That meant the torpedo boat had to approach a battleship to point-blank range, hoping not a single heavy gun would blow it out of the water. In exercises, it worked. In actual combat, nobody had tested it. The fleet needs power. The fleet needs armor. The fleet needs battleships. These two positions had no middle ground. This was not a discussion. It was a war for the soul of the French Navy. And it was fought not on the open sea, but in the offices of the ministry, at committee meetings, and in the corridors of power. Every change of government, and in France they changed often, meant a new round. Today, the supporters of the Jeune École won. Tomorrow, the pendulum swung back. The day after, it swung again. And it was in this exact atmosphere that the people who designed the ships had to work. Engineers who had to guess what the next minister would want to see. Which doctrine would be victorious by the time the ship was finished? Whose demands to fulfill? This is where a man enters the story who deserves a special mention. His name was Louis de Bussy, chief naval engineer, the man tasked with designing the new battleship. De Bussy was a professional of the highest caliber. He understood hydrodynamics, armor, and artillery. He knew how to calculate loads and distribute weight. He knew what a ship should be. But he also perfectly understood the system he was working in. The design of the new battleship was born in an environment where every higher-ranking official felt it was their duty to make an amendment, where requirements changed before they could even be drawn onto blueprints, where committee after committee gathered, argued, made decisions, and dispersed, leaving behind a new stack of contradictory instructions. De Bussy did what he could. He tried to maintain logic. He tried to hold on to balance. But the system was stronger. In 1881, at the shipyard in Toulon, the keel was laid. The ship was given the name Hoche, in honor of a French general of the Revolutionary Wars, Lazare Hoche, who died young and managed to win where others had failed. No one at that moment could have guessed that the name would be prophetic, that this ship, too, would struggle in conditions where victory was impossible, and that it would take so long to build that the very definition of a modern warship would change several times while it sat on the slipway. Another superstructure, another meeting, another year. The first year of 10. Imagine this scenario. You are an architect. You've been hired to design a house. You sit down, calculate, and draw. Foundation, walls, roof. Everything is precise. Everything supports everything else. Then the first client comes in and says, "Let's add another floor." Fine. You recalculate the foundation, reinforce the walls. The second one comes in. What about a balcony? A big one, with columns. The third wants a turret. The fourth wants a glass conservatory. The fifth says the conservatory ruins his view and demands it be moved. 2 years later, you look at the blueprint and don't recognize your own work. But every single decision was documented, justified, approved. This is exactly how Hoche was designed. The original 1881 design was a perfectly reasonable ship. De Bussy started with proven solutions. The layout was based on the ironclad Redoutable, a ship that had already been serving in the French Navy for several years and had proven itself capable. 2 main gun turrets at the ends, an armored belt at the waterline, a moderate superstructure, a displacement of about 10,000 tons. Nothing revolutionary, but reliable and functional. De Bussy knew that this was the ship the fleet needed. The fleet, however, knew differently. The first revisions arrived a few months after the keel was laid. The Navy's Artillery Committee decreed, the caliber of the main guns must be increased. A decision was made to switch to the new 340mm guns instead of the originally planned ones. The guns were genuinely outstanding. French artillery in this period was top tier. But heavier guns meant heavier turrets. Heavier turrets meant a redistribution of weight. A redistribution of weight meant recalculating the entire project. De Bussy recalculated, made the changes. Work continued. Then came the next set of revisions. The Commission on Buoyancy demanded that the armored belt at the extremities be reinforced. Another recalculation. More changes. Several more months lost. Then, the tactical department decided the ship needed a more powerful secondary battery to repel torpedo boat attacks. Light guns were added to the upper deck. They needed firing positions. The positions needed splinter protection. That meant more armor, more weight. Another recalculation. You can see the pattern. Every decision was correct in isolation. Heavier guns? Yes, necessary. Protection for the extremities? Reasonable. Anti-torpedo boat artillery? Essential. But no one was looking at the ship as a whole. No one was saying, wait, let's calculate what happens to the entire design when we add all of this at the same time. Or rather, there was one person. Bussy calculated, and he spoke up. He was listened to politely. They nodded, and they added the next superstructure. By 1883, something appeared on the Hoche that wasn't in the original design at all. Fighting tops on the masts. Enclosed platforms high above the deck from which riflemen could fire down on enemy commanders and gun crews. The idea wasn't new. Fighting tops had been used since the days of sail. But on an ironclad, where the center of gravity was already highly questionable, adding heavy structures to the very top of the masts was a decision of the kind people later speak about very delicately. Bussy wrote a report. The report contained numbers. The numbers spoke about the metacentric height, about what happens to a ship's stability when the top weight exceeds the design limits. The report was taken into consideration. The fighting tops were approved. By 1884, the original blueprints of 1881 had turned into a historical document. Formally, it was the same ship, the same name, the same slipway, the same workers. But if you place the first sketch next to the current blueprints, the resemblance was purely theoretical. The ship was growing, not in length and not in width. It was growing upward. Every new requirement added something above the deck. Superstructures, platforms, bridges, structures that held guns, rangefinders, searchlights, lifeboats, ventilation shafts. By the mid-1880s, Hoche had a silhouette that even its own creators could not describe without pausing. Another superstructure, another meeting, another year. But the ship still wasn't finished, and the worst decisions were yet to come. Too long. Slipway number 3. Workers are laying the first frames. The keel is already in place. All around is the smell of hot metal, the ringing of riveting hammers, the shouts of foremen. A normal morning at the shipyard. Nobody knows that this ship will sit here for another 9 years. For comparison, 9 years is the time it takes a child to grow from a first grader into a teenager. In 9 years, governments, doctrines, ministers, and chief engineers all have time to change. In 9 years, the world around you changes beyond recognition. For a battleship, 9 years on the slipway is a death sentence. But let's walk this path together, year by year, because the devil here is in the details. Hoche is on the slipway, framing the hull, riveting the armor plates. Work is on schedule. In this same year, the British lay down HMS Collingwood, a new generation of battleship. It will be ready in 5 years. French naval attachés in London send reports. The reports are read. Heads nod. The riveting continues. Fighting tops are added to the design. We've already talked about this. Bussy again calculates the metacentric height. The numbers do not make him happy. In Italy, the battleship Italia is launched this year. Huge, high-sided, with monstrous 431mm guns, the largest naval guns in the world at the time. The Italians built fast and without excess committees. Bussy looks at the Italian blueprints, then at his own, then back at the Italian ones. Revisions to the project multiply. The artillery committee demands stronger anti-torpedo armament. The threat from torpedo boats is being taken more seriously. Several more positions for light guns are added to the Hoche. Each position requires a platform. Each platform requires railings and access bridges. The silhouette of the ship on the blueprint begins to resemble a multi-story building that someone dropped onto the hull of an ironclad. Another meeting is held at the ministry. They discuss the progress of construction. One of the admirals asks, "When will the ship be ready?" The chief engineer answers evasively. The protocol of this meeting has survived. The word evasively is not written in it, but reading between the lines, That is exactly what it says. The Jeune École is gaining political weight. Next year, Aube will become minister, and funding for capital ships will be slashed again. The pace of work on Hoche slows down, not because there are no workers, but because there is no certainty that this ship is even needed in the form it is being built. Several officials in Aube's circle openly say, maybe we should stop? Rebuild it into a floating base for torpedo boats. This is not a joke. This was a real proposal discussed at a real meeting. Construction on the ship continues. HMS Collingwood enters service with the British fleet. 4 305mm guns in barbettes. A clean, functional silhouette. Reasonable seaworthiness. The British didn't chase a perfect design. They built a good ship in a reasonable time frame. Collingwood is already on duty. Already going out on maneuvers. Already firing in exercises. Hoche sits on the slipway in Toulon. There are photographs from that period. You can see that the hull is practically finished. The armor belt is in place. Turrets are being installed. But above the main deck, there already looms the thing that will turn the ship into the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. Superstructures rise tier by tier. Funnels stick out at different angles. Their placement changed as the layout of the boilers changed. The masts carry the fighting tops. Heavy, clumsy, and definitely not designed for combat on the open sea. The workers in these photos stand next to the ship and look into the lens. Their expressions are calm. A job is a job. The project receives another round of revisions, this time at the insistence of the Survivability Commission. They demand additional watertight bulkheads, more internal hull work. Another delay. In Russia, the ironclad Imperator Nikolai I is laid down this year, and it will enter service faster than the Hoche. The Russian fleet, which the French had for years considered technically inferior. Bussy submits his final calculation of the metacentric height. The number he gets is 0.8 meters. This is not catastrophic, but it is terribly low for a ship with so much top weight. It means that in rough seas, the ship will have a slow, heavy roll, and firing a full broadside will cause a sharp list to one side. The crew on the upper platforms will literally have to hold on for dear life. The number is taken into consideration. Work is almost finished. Hoche is being prepared for launch. The first articles appear in the press. Journalists write about the fleet's new flagship. Most of them haven't even seen the ship yet. Those who have describe it with deliberate caution. One reporter writes that the silhouette of the Hoche leaves an indelible impression. He is clearly choosing his words carefully. 9 years after the keel was laid, Hoche is launched into the water. She sits at the fitting out wall, huge, dark, draped in superstructures. The sun plays on the damp armor plates. Workers stand on the quay. Someone claps. Bussy, they say, was a man of few words that day. Another superstructure. Another meeting. Another year. Only now, the years had run out. Now the world was going to see the result. The whole thing, in its entirety, in broad daylight. And the world saw it. Let's stand on the quay in Toulon, 1890. Autumn. The air smells of salt and fuel oil. Before us is the Hoche. Hull length, 101 meters. Width, 22 meters. Displacement, about 10,600 tons. If you know anything about battleships of this era, the numbers sound perfectly reasonable, perfectly standard. Nothing that would raise an alarm. But the numbers are not what you see in front of you. Let's start from the bottom. Along the waterline runs the armored belt. Thickness in the middle section, 450 millimeters, nearly half a meter of forged steel. That is serious. That is very serious, even by the standards of the 1890s. The French School of Armor Design always prioritized protecting the waterline along the entire length of the hull, and here this tradition was followed to excess. Piercing such a belt with the naval guns of the time at combat ranges was extremely difficult. You could say the underwater section of the Hoche was virtually invulnerable. It is important to remember this, because from here on up, everything gets significantly more interesting. Above the armored belt, the hull begins. Here are the engine and boiler rooms. 4 steam engines, 12 boilers. Power output? About 11,000 horsepower. Theoretically, this was supposed to provide a speed of 16 knots. In practice, slightly less. On sea trials, Hoche hit 15.3. For a battleship of that time, entirely respectable. But we are still at the bottom. The most interesting part is higher up, the main deck. This is where the things begin that turn the ship's silhouette into a riddle for anyone who saw it for the first time. In the bow section is the first gun turret. Inside it are two 340mm guns. You need to grasp the scale. Each barrel is about 10 meters long. The shell weighs around 450 kilograms. For comparison, that is roughly the weight of a small car, flying out of a barrel at the speed of a cannonball. Such a shell, from a distance of 2 kilometers, could punch through a steel plate more than half a meter thick. The guns were outstanding. Truly outstanding. French artillery in this period was among the best in the world, and that is not an exaggeration. If the Hoche had been able to shoot normally with these guns, she would have posed a lethal threat to any contemporary warship. The caveat "if" is the key here, but more on that later. In the stern section is the second turret, identical, 2 guns, same caliber. Between the turrets lies the middle section of the hull with a casemate, which housed the medium caliber battery, 161mm. These were guns for fighting unarmored ships, repelling torpedo boats, and suppressing the enemy's deck structures. There are several of them on each side, plus small caliber artillery, 47mm and 37mm guns, placed literally anywhere there was room. On the superstructures, on the bridges, on special brackets along the side. By the time the ship entered service, there were more than 15 of these smaller barrels. Here is where the real tour begins. Above the main deck is the first level of the superstructure. Here you have the steering gear room, auxiliary mechanisms, and some of the light guns. Above that is the second tier, the navigating bridge, the chart house. Above that is the third tier, the conning tower, an armored dome from which the commander directs the ship in battle. The armor of the conning tower is decent, 200mm. This is a correct decision. But above the conning tower is a fourth tier, an open bridge. Above that, searchlight platforms. Above those, ventilation cowls, boat cranes, and belaying pin rails for rigging. Then, a fifth tier, and a sixth. 2 masts rise above all of this, like the masts of a sailing ship to which someone bolted armor and steam engines. On each mast is a fighting top, an enclosed, armored platform high above the deck, designed for riflemen and light rapid-fire guns to shoot top-down onto enemy decks. In theory, it's clever. In theory. In practice, the fighting top of the Hoche was located roughly 12 meters above the waterline. 12 meters is the height of a 4-story building. Imagine standing on an open platform of a 4-story building. Now imagine that this building is sitting on a ship in the open sea in a state 3 or 4 swell. The building is swaying. Not fast, slowly and heavily, like a pendulum. To one side, to the other, back again. That is exactly how the men in the fighting tops of the Hoche felt in anything but dead calm water. And now, the most important part. The thing Bussy wrote about in his reports, which the committee simply took into consideration. The metacentric height. For those unfamiliar with the term, let me explain it visually. Imagine a glass of water. If the glass is wide and squat, it's hard to tip over. If the glass is narrow and tall, it tips over from the slightest push. Metacentric height is, roughly speaking, how squat a ship is in terms of stability. The higher this number, the more stable the ship, and the faster it returns to a vertical position after a roll. For the Hoche, this number was 0.8 meters. For a ship with so many heavy structures up high, this is dangerously low. What this meant in practice was the following. When firing a broadside from the main caliber guns, if both turrets turned to the same side and opened fire simultaneously, the ship would take a sharp list. It wasn't dangerous to her buoyancy, but it was incredibly noticeable. So noticeable that gun crews on the upper platforms and in the fighting tops literally had to grab the railings at that moment. There was another effect that became apparent during sea trials. When moving through waves, Hoche had a slow, deep roll from side to side. Not sharp, like a stable ship that quickly rights itself. Slow, heavy, almost solemn. French sailors called this rocking la balancelle, the swing or the pendulum. One officer who served on Hoche in her early years wrote in a private letter, preserved in a family archive and published in the 20th century. He wrote to a friend, "The ship sways like a drunk priest after Sunday Mass, majestically and completely uncontrollably." The nickname Notre Dame de la Trinité, Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, stuck to the ship almost immediately after its launch. There were several reasons. First, the silhouette. If you looked at Hoche in profile from a distance, the jumble of superstructures, funnels, and fighting tops really did look like a Gothic cathedral. Not because it was beautiful, because there was just so much of it, sticking out in every direction. Second, the solemnity of its movement. The slow, swaying Hoche moved across the roadstead with such dignity that comparing it to a religious procession felt inevitable. Third, and this is the most accurate part, inside, Hoche was just as dark, confusing, and solemn as a massive cathedral. Corridors, ladders, compartments, transitions between superstructures, it all formed a labyrinth that new crew members spent weeks trying to learn. So, summing up, before us is a ship with outstanding armor, superb guns, adequate speed, and a silhouette that caused anyone who saw it to stand in stunned silence. A ship that could deliver a devastating strike, if it could shoot straight while riding the waves. A ship that was invulnerable from below, and incredibly vulnerable to everything happening to it from above. In 1892, 11 years after her keel was laid, Hoche was officially commissioned into the French Navy. Flagship of the squadron, pride of the Republic, the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. Now, they actually had to serve on her. There is a moment in the life of every ship, a moment when it stops being a blueprint, a project, a subject of arguments in committee meetings, when the crew comes aboard, when the boilers are lit, when the anchor chain begins to clank out of the hawse pipe, and the ship moves under its own power for the first time. At that moment, the ship comes alive. Hoche came alive in 1892, and her life turned out to be exactly what you would expect for a ship with such a biography. Difficult, contradictory, at times absurd, and yet, in its own way, dignified. Let's start with the people. The crew of the Hoche numbered about 600 men, officers, petty officers, stokers, gunners, topmen, mechanics. Men who did not choose which ship they were assigned to. They received their orders and arrived at their duty station. And they would have to live on this ship for months, some for years. The first commanding officer of Hoche was Captain First Rank Henri Disgrace, a man with a reputation as a pedant and a perfectionist. Rumor has it he took command with the look of a man who had been handed a high honor and a severe trial simultaneously. The first, because it was the flagship. The second, because he had already read the technical specifications. Disgrace was a professional. He didn't complain out loud. He worked with what he had. And what he had was the following. First, a ventilation problem. The massive pile of superstructures created turbulent airflows that no one had calculated during the design phase. In tropical weather, and Hoche was based in Toulon and periodically sailed the Mediterranean, the lower compartments turned into baking ovens of stagnant air. Stokers at the boilers worked in conditions that today would be called unacceptable. The temperature in the boiler rooms during the summer months reached 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Second, the problem of navigating inside the ship. We've mentioned this already. Hoche was a labyrinth. But under combat conditions, when a sailor needed to get quickly from the aft casemate to the forward turret, the labyrinth became a deadly hazard. Disgrace instituted a mandatory program. Every new crew member underwent 2 weeks of topographical training. They just walked around the ship, memorized routes, learned the ladders, in the dark, so they could navigate with their eyes closed. This is not an exaggeration. This was an actual requirement recorded in the ship's logbook. Third, the rolling. We need to pause on this because the rolling of the Hoche wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a characteristic that directly impacted the combat effectiveness of the ship. In the autumn of 1892, Hoche went out on its first serious voyage, Toulon to Toulon, crossing the Gulf of Lyons and back. The route isn't extreme, but the Gulf of Lyons is known for its temper. The wind changes quickly here, and the waves can be steep and nasty, even in moderate winds. The sea state was 3. Not a storm, not extreme conditions. Ordinary autumn Mediterranean weather. Hoche began her pendulum roll almost immediately after leaving the harbor. Slowly to port, slowly to starboard. The amplitude wasn't huge, maybe 8 to 10 degrees, but the period of the oscillation, the time it took to roll from one side to the other, was long, unpleasantly long. The human body tolerates slow, long-period rolling worse than anything else. A short, sharp chop is exhausting. A long, solemn sway makes you seasick. On her very first time out at sea, more than 100 crew members suffered from severe seasickness. On a ship based in Toulon, in the Mediterranean Sea, among men who, for the most part, had served in the Navy for years. Duperré wrote about this in his report, calmly, professionally. No complaints, no drama. Just facts and figures. Now, about the gunnery exercises. The first artillery drills for Hoche took place in the spring of 1893. They didn't fire full broadsides, just single shots from the main battery, as a start, to see how the ship would react. The ship reacted exactly as Debussy's numbers had predicted. Every shot from the 340mm gun caused a noticeable list to the opposite side. Not catastrophic. The ship wasn't going to capsize, but enough that by the time the first gun recoiled, the second gun in the turret was pointing somewhere entirely different from where it had been aimed. They tried a full broadside. Both turrets aimed to port. 4 main caliber guns firing simultaneously. The list was so violent that the officer on the upper bridge grabbed the railing with both hands. One of the topmen in the fighting top lost his balance and fell onto the platform, thankfully inward and not overboard. Several men on open deck positions stayed on their feet only because they had braced themselves in advance. This wasn't a storm. This was the ship simply firing its own guns. And now, the report. In the summer of 1893, Hoche participated in squadron maneuvers in the Mediterranean. Several ships, a few days of exercises, simulated combat engagements. After the maneuvers, every commander was required to submit a detailed report. Duperré wrote his report. It was detailed. Very detailed. It covered everything. The rolling, the gunnery, the ventilation, internal navigation, the time to bring guns into action, and the crew's reaction speed in emergencies. The final section of the report was titled simply, Conclusions. What exactly Duperré wrote in this section, we do not know in full. The document was classified by the Ministry of the Navy almost immediately upon receipt. The classified status was lifted only in 1913, 20 years later. By that time, Hoche had long since been removed from active service. But parts of the content are known through indirect sources. Mentions in the correspondence of naval officers, references in later documents. Duperré wrote that Hoche, in her current state, was incapable of fighting an effective artillery battle in seas higher than a State 2. He wrote that the arrangement of the superstructures created dead zones for the guns that were never mentioned in the design. He wrote that the speed of ammunition delivery to the main battery was half the calculated rate because the supply routes went through too many twists and turns. And he wrote a sentence that was later quoted by several naval historians. It sounded something like this. The ship represents an outstanding engineering achievement. It would be superb as a floating fortress anchored in port. As a combat vessel on the open sea, it represents a threat primarily to its own crew. That is why the report was classified. Not because it was a lie, but because it was the truth. And this truth concerned not just the Hoche, but the entire system that spawned her. All the committees, all the revisions, all the compromises. But you know what? Despite all of this, Hoche served. She went to sea, participated in maneuvers, stood in the roadstead as the squadron flagship. Her 340mm guns were loaded and maintained. Her boilers were fired every day. 600 men lived on her, worked, ate, slept, and stood watch. There is something honorable in this stubbornness. The ship didn't ask to be built this way. She just existed, and she served as best she could. Among the crew, Hoche evoked a very specific feeling. Not love, no. More like a grim attachment. The kind you feel for something that is incredibly inconvenient, but undeniably yours. The sailors called her our cathedral, with an intonation that carried both mockery and something resembling affection. An old stoker who served on Hoche in the mid-1890s told a journalist writing a history of the French fleet many years later. It was a strange ship, uncomfortable, hot, rocked like a cradle. But when you stood on her deck and looked at the sea, you felt like you were in the highest place in the world, because the only thing higher than you were those damn fighting tops. Hoche served. But while she was on duty in the Mediterranean, a crisis was brewing within the French Navy. A crisis that would put an end to an entire generation of ships. To Hoche and her brethren. To the system that spawned them. To the very idea of what the French fleet should be. The pendulum swung for the final time. In 1895, the Japanese fleet annihilated the Chinese fleet at the Battle of the Yalu River. Few people remember this battle today, but at the time, it had the effect of an exploding bomb in naval headquarters around the world. Because at Yalu, modern armored ships clashed in real combat for the first time. And the results of this battle provided answers to questions that theoreticians had argued over for years. Torpedo boats played no role in the battle whatsoever. Light cruisers without heavy armor burned and sank from enemy shells. The battle was decided entirely by battleships, heavy, slow, steel-clad ships that the Jeune École had declared obsolete. Admiral Aube had left his post as minister several years prior, but his doctrine lived on. Its supporters still held positions, still influenced decisions, still argued. After Yalu, arguing became significantly harder. But let's step back a little, because the collapse of the Jeune École wasn't just one moment or one battle. It was an accumulation of mistakes, each obvious on its own, but together yielding a result that shook even the most staunch supporters of the doctrine. Let's start with the torpedo boats. France built a lot of them, a whole lot. By the mid-1890s, the French Navy had one of the largest torpedo boat fleets in the world. Small, fast, armed with torpedoes. Exactly what Aube had preached. In exercises, they showed brilliant results. They attacked the mock enemy, fired torpedoes, scored theoretical hits. Victory after victory in the calm waters of French anchorages. And then real deployments began. It turned out that the torpedo boats of that era had a seaworthiness that could only be called satisfactory under very specific conditions. The Baltic in a storm? Not for them. The Bay of Biscay in autumn? Not for them. Even the Mediterranean in the winter months produced waves that caused the little ships to lose speed and cease being combat-effective units. The torpedoes of the time had an effective range of about 300 meters. That meant the torpedo boat had to get practically point-blank to the battleship. In conditions of real combat, under the fire of anti-torpedo artillery, at night or in fog, it was a suicide mission. In exercises, it worked beautifully. In reality, it didn't work at all. The French admirals who had opposed the Jeune École from the very beginning now got the chance to say, "We warned you." They said it. Loudly. In several memorandums and at multiple meetings. And right here, the true cost of the doctrinal war became apparent. While French officials argued, battleships or torpedo boats? While budgets were slashed and reallocated? While every change in government meant a new round of fighting over naval policy, the other naval powers were building ships. Britain was building. Germany was building. Russia was building. Italy was building. Even Japan, a country European naval officers had patronizingly dismissed just recently, was building battleships based on British designs and British technology. By 1900, the numbers looked like this. The British fleet was first in the world. This surprised no one. The German fleet, under the leadership of Admiral Tirpitz, was experiencing explosive growth. Kaiser Wilhelm personally oversaw every keel laid. This too was understandable. The Russian fleet, following massive construction programs, held the third position. The French Navy was fourth. Fourth. The country that in 1860 had the premier fleet in the world. The country that in the 60s had set the tone for global shipbuilding. A country with outstanding engineers, a rich naval tradition, and access to the best steel and the best technologies. Fourth place. And that was an optimistic assessment, because it wasn't just about quantity, it was about quality and the condition of the ships. By this point, the French Navy was a collection of ships built in different years under different doctrines. The ships of the Jeune École, light cruisers and torpedo boats, and the ships of the traditional school, battleships, each of which took years to build and bore the scars of endless compromises. There was no unified squadron tactic. The ships weren't designed to operate together. The doctrine that was supposed to unite the fleet into a single fighting force simply did not exist. Hoche and her contemporaries, the battleships Marceau, Neptune, Magenta, built around the same time and on similar principles, stood anchored in Toulon and Brest. Flagships on paper. Ships with powerful armament and difficult temperaments. Smart people in the Ministry of the Navy looked at all this and understood. Something had to change. Not just building new ships, changing the system, changing the approach, changing how decisions were made. The realization came. But it came 20 years late. 20 years of doctrinal wars. 20 years of slashed budgets. 20 years of ships built wrong and built at the wrong time. Hoche was the most glaring symbol of those 20 years. Not because she was the worst, but because she was the most visible. Her silhouette spoke for itself, louder than any report, louder than any memo. When you look at Hoche, you don't need to read the history of the French Navy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's all right there. In every extra superstructure, in every fighting top, in every compromised decision frozen in metal. Another superstructure, another meeting, another year. Only now, those years had cost France something much greater than just money and time. They had cost the nation its position on the global chessboard, the respect of its allies, the fear of its enemies. Hoche, meanwhile, continued to serve, as if not noticing anything around her, rocking on the Mediterranean waves, smoking her funnels, carrying her outstanding guns above the water with the same solemnity with which a cathedral carries its spires over a city. And the end of her story turned out to be just as unexpected as everything else in her biography. In 1896, Vice Admiral Jean-Louis de Lauracille was appointed head of the Naval Council. A man of few words, methodical, and possessing a quality rare among French naval bureaucrats of the time. He knew how to look at things without illusions. The first thing he did in his new position was ask to be brought all the classified reports from ship commanders over the last 10 years. All of them, including that very report from Captain Duperré in 1893. They say he read them for 3 days, almost without a break. On the 4th day, he wrote a memorandum, short, only 4 pages. It contained no accusations and sought no scapegoats. It contained only one idea, formulated with surgical precision. The French Navy is sick. The disease is this. Decisions are made by people who bear no responsibility for them. The cure is one thing. Every technical decision must be signed off by one person, and that person must know that if the ship fails to meet the requirements, they alone will answer for it. It sounds obvious, almost banal, but up until that moment, the French Navy had operated entirely in reverse. Decisions were made by committees. A committee bears no responsibility. It is shared equally by every member, which means no one bears it at all. It was precisely this system that produced the Hoche, and it was precisely this system that de la Racille intended to break. The reform moves slowly. Bureaucratic systems don't change from a single memo, even the most accurate one. But the process was launched. And by the end of the 1890s, the new ships of the French fleet began to look different. The Charlemagne-class battleships, 3 ships laid down in 1894, were entirely different. A clean silhouette, 2 main turrets fore and aft, ditching the old lozenge layout, moderate superstructures, a reasonable metacentric height. They weren't revolutionary. The British and Germans were building better ones, but they were normal, functional, fit for service. French shipbuilding was getting off its knees. In Hoche, all this time continued to serve. No longer a flagship. No longer the first line, but still in the ranks. The final years of her active service were spent in the Mediterranean squadron. Exercises, port visits, representational duties. She was, after all, a large, impressive-looking ship, provided you looked at her from the right distance and in the right mood. In 1898, Hoche participated in maneuvers alongside the new Charlemagne-class battleships. Those standing on the bridges of the new ships, looking over at Hoche, would recall later, it was like looking at an aging father, older, slower, no longer as strong, but still standing. In 1900, Hoche was retired from the active fleet. The official phrasing was standard, struck from the Naval Register due to the expiration of operational life. 19 years since her keel was laid. 8 years of actual service. For comparison, HMS Collingwood, laid down in that same year of 1882, served for 23 years. For a time, Hoche stood in the Toulon roadstead as a target ship for gunnery practice. This was the final service she provided to the fleet. Her armored belt faithfully absorbed practice shells, demonstrating the exact quality that had always been her greatest strength. The armor on Hoche was the real deal. In 1910, the ship was sold for scrap. She was dismantled at the very same shipyard in Toulon where she had been built. Workers cut away the superstructures one by one, removed the turrets, peeled back the armor plates. The big ship grew smaller every day. The metal would go to the smelter, likely to be reborn as new ships. Normal ones, without excess superstructures and fighting tops at impossible heights. Nobody came to watch the dismantling. No ceremonies. Just a job. And right here is the most unexpected twist in the history of the Hoche. A twist rarely mentioned when the ship is remembered. Hoche killed the French Navy. That is true. She and her contemporaries, Marceau, Neptune, Magenta, were living monuments to the systemic errors of 2 decades. Their construction consumed the resources, time, and engineering potential that could have been spent on something better. But it was also the Hoche that saved it, or rather, her reputation did. Because whenever discussions began at the Naval Ministry about new ships, someone would invariably say, "Remember the Hoche?" And that was enough. The word Hoche became a password. A code word that meant, don't do that. Never do that again. When someone suggested adding one more superstructure, someone would say, Hoche. When a committee wanted to make yet another revision to an already approved design, someone would say, Hoche. When the artillery department demanded more guns be placed on a ship than the metacentric height would allow, someone would say, Hoche. And it worked. Not immediately. Not always. But it worked. There is a term in naval history, a lesson ship. It's a ship that achieved nothing great in battle, didn't win a single engagement, and didn't enter into any heroic chronicles. But its very existence, the very fact of its construction and service, changed how people thought and made decisions after it. Hoche was a lesson ship. Painful, expensive, solemn in its ugliness, but a lesson. A navy that builds such a ship, but is then capable of looking at it, admitting its mistake, and changing itself, is a living navy. A navy capable of learning. There are navies that are not capable, but that is another story. For now, One final image. Toulon, 1910. Autumn. Workers are cutting away the last of Hoche's superstructures. Where the fighting tops once loomed, there is now open sky. Where tier after tier of bridges and platforms were piled high, there is now only the hull. Bare. Honest. Stripped of everything unnecessary. Exactly how she was supposed to be from the very beginning. We began by standing on the quay in Toulon and looking at the Hoche. Turrets, funnels, superstructures, fighting tops, more superstructures. The Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. At the time, it looked like a joke, like a curiosity of naval history. The ugliest ship in the world. Point and laugh. But now, knowing everything we know, try looking at her again. Every extra superstructure is someone's decision, made in a committee where no one took personal responsibility. Every fighting top is the victory of one department over the common sense of another. Every extra year on the slipway is a doctrinal war, in which both sides were so busy fighting each other, they forgot about the ship itself. Hoche is not ugly. Hoche is honest. She looks exactly like the system that created her, without embellishment, without airbrushing. All of it on the outside. All the compromises, all the mistakes, all the just one more revision we promise. Frozen in metal, towering 12 meters above the Mediterranean waves. That is why this ship is worth knowing. Not because she fought in great battles, not because she changed the course of history, but because she asks a question, and she asks it of everyone who looks at her. Think of any large project around you, any structure that has grown over the years, accumulating layers, requirements, and approvals, where every individual decision was rational, but the end result leaves you speechless. And ask yourself, where is the Hoche in this project? Because it is there. It almost always is. This was the story of the French ironclad battleship Hoche, the flagship they were afraid to build, the ship they were embarrassed to love, and the lesson the French Navy remembered for a generation to come. If this story hooked you, subscribe. This is where we break down topics exactly like this, about ships, about systems, about the people inside them, about how huge decisions are made in tiny steps, and about how sometimes the ugliest object in the harbor is the most honest one.